Hello, humans, hello, humans, hello, humans of the world. It's me, Ellie Krug, on Ellie 2.0 radio on lovely AM 950, talking to you on this second day of October, first Saturday in October. And boy, I'll tell you, if you'd had the luck to take the last 2 weeks of September off for vacation, you would have had. The weather here in Minnesota has been incredible the last 2 weeks, and so very, very lucky. We have a great show today. The big interview is with Art Cullen. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist out of Storm Lake, Iowa. He's going to talk about a documentary by that title, Storm Lake. And then in my C block, I'm going to talk about my work, about a woman who believes in me and champion me. She happens to be 75 years old. So I'll tell you that story. But let's begin. Remember, our show is about idealism and idealists. And let's begin with our featured idealist. And I have to admit that I am incredibly embarrassed that our idealist, Pauli Murray, is someone I was unaware of until very recently, which reinforces that there is just so much more for me to learn about this incredible world of ours. And it also reinforces that maybe I just don't have as good an education as perhaps I thought I did. Who is Pauli Murray? Well, to begin with, Pauli, who is black and who was assigned female at birth, but later in life identified as male at different times in her life, she is somebody who you will hear me as I do this piece about her. I will be using the pronoun they out of respect. And that's partly because of what I just said. At different parts of Pauli Murray's life, Pauli identified as female, other times as male, and maybe what we would call non-binary today. So Pauli Murray was born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1910 and given the name of Anna Pauline. Quickly, Pauli's life was marked by tragedy. Beginning with when Pauli was 4 years old, their mother died of a cerebral hemorrhage. And just 9 years later, Pauli's father, who was a principal in the Baltimore School District and who suffered from depression severe enough to be hospitalized, he was murdered by a white guard at an institution, because we used to have mental institutions. So Pauli's father was murdered in 1923. Thus, by the time that Pauli was just 13 years old, they were orphaned. Eventually, Pauli went to live with their aunt and namesake, Pauline Fitzgerald Dane, and grandparents in Durham, North Carolina. At age 16, Pauli graduated from high school and went to live in New York City and to attend Hunter College. This gives you an idea of how fearless Pauli was, going to New York City at age 16. It was while Pauli was at Hunter College that they changed their birth name from Anna Pauline to Pauli, P-A-U-L-I. At the same time, Pauli took the extraordinary step. So we are talking early 1930s. At the same time, Pauli took the extraordinary step to seek ways of taking male hormones. But Pauli was rebuffed and denied that kind of treatment. Think about that. Think about how brave, how incredible Pauli was at such an early age. After graduating from Hunter College in 1933, Pauli worked for the Works Projects Administration, the WPA, as a remedial reading teacher in New York City. At the same time, Pauli became involved in the civil rights movement. And in 1938, they began a campaign to enroll in law school at the all-white University of North Carolina Law School. Pauli got no help from the NAACP, in part because Pauli was identified as female at birth. But incredibly, Eleanor Roosevelt, that would be that Eleanor Roosevelt, searched out Pauli. When Eleanor heard about Pauli's efforts to get into UNC. And what happened then is that Eleanor and Pauli developed a long-standing friendship with correspondence and meetings over time. Pauli didn't get into UNC, but they did enroll at Howard University Law School. But before that happened, in March 1940, Pauli set out to end segregation in public transport. It didn't go well, as you could expect, and she was arrested in Richmond, Virginia for refusing to sit at the back of the bus. Now, for the record, that was 15 years before Rosa Parks. So you have this firecracker of a human. Feisty is a word that Ruth Bader Ginsburg used to describe Pauli Murray. You have this feisty human 15 years before Rosa Parks trying to desegregate public transportation. At the time that Pauli was engaged in their own personal civil rights work, Pauli was also a prolific writer and poet. In 1943, Pauli wrote 2 civil rights essays, one of which was titled, "Negroes Are Fed Up." And then another was an essay about the Harlem Race Riot. At age 34, Pauli graduated at the top of their law school class at Howard University. And it was at Howard that Pauli coined the phrase Jane Crow to describe their experiences, the experiences of women as being oppressed during Jim Crow South. Traditionally, the top Howard Law School graduate, which was Pauli, which Pauli fit that category, would be given a fellowship that would allow them to undergo advanced legal studies at Harvard Law School. But Harvard rejected Pauli because of their gender. Remember, they were identified as female at birth. As a result, Pauli went to the University of California, Bolt Law School, where Pauli earned a Master's of Law degree and wrote a thesis titled "The Right to Equal Opportunity in Employment." Again, so far ahead in their time. After law school in California, Pauli returned to New York City, where they wrote a book. It was titled States' Laws on Race and Color. The book was commissioned by the United Methodist Women as a way of the UMW to support the civil rights movement. Now, I'm just going to parenthetically throw something else in here. It was only a couple of weeks ago that I was in Fridley at a church, a Methodist church, where that chapter, the Fridley chapter of the United Methodist Women, had sponsored me. They had asked me to come in and talk about LGBTQ rights and what it meant to be LGBTQ. I'm learning. United Methodist Women wasn't on my radar before this. Okay? All right, back to our show. The great Thurgood Marshall would later call Pauli's book, that is, the book about states' laws on race and color, Thurgood Marshall, because remember, it was Thurgood Marshall who argued Brown versus Board of Education. He would call Pauli's book the Bible for the civil rights movement, for civil rights litigators. Again, it's a book written by a black who was identified as female at birth and who was instead very LGBTQ, it appears, very maybe non-binary, it appears, way ahead of their time. In the mid-1950s, Pauli was hired as a trial lawyer at a new law firm named Paul, Weiss, and Rifkin. By the way, that is now one of the major largest law firms in the country, in the world. And Paul Weiss, that law firm, this was groundbreaking because in the 1950s, law firms were barely hiring women, let alone a black woman. And it was there that Pauli met their longtime partner, Irene Barlow. And they were together for, it sounds like, almost 20 years before Irene died. By the early 1960s, Pauli Murray had gained enough notoriety that President Kennedy appointed them to his Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. At about the same time, Pauli was fighting with civil rights leaders over the way that black women weren't allowed leadership roles in the movement. Feisty. By 1966, Pauli had helped found the National Organization for Women. You know that, listeners. Now, NOW. She did that with Betty Friedan. Eventually, though, Pauli became disenchanted with NOW because it wasn't advancing or addressing issues affecting black and working class women. So she left. Soon, Pauli was on another journey. She attended a seminary to become an Episcopal priest. And in 1977, at the age of 67, Pauli became the first black person perceived as a woman to become an Episcopal priest. Think about that. That was like 1977, not all that long ago. 8 years later, in 1985, Pauli Murray died of cancer. Again, I can't believe that I didn't know about this incredible idealist. And if you want to know more, there's a new film, and the film is titled My Name is Pauli Murray. It's on Amazon Prime Video. If you watch it, you'll hear the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, as I said, call Pauli a feisty woman, unquote. Now, it's unfortunate that she used the phrase woman, but it was RBG saying feisty. That's what, some idealists do. They show up as feisty. What a darn compliment. And I am totally in awe that Pauli Murray would be who she wanted to be. I mean, she got derailed from taking hormones, and I'm sorry that was the case. And I've seen some of her writings where she talked about being so depressed about not being able to be her true self. But in the end, look at what she accomplished with all of her energy. I am in awe of this human. And now I will not forget the name Pauli Murray. Hopefully you won't either. Okay, that's it for our first segment. When we come back, we'll do the big interview with Art Cullen. You're going to love the interview. Art is quite the charismatic, bit of a character interviewee. So we'll be back with the interview. Thanks. Hang on. Thanks for everything. Bye. We're back. Ellie 2.0 Radio on AM 950. Okay, so make sure you check out the documentary about Pauli Murray if you can, if you have Amazon Prime. If not, just go and Google Pauli Murray. You'll find out that there's a whole history center related to Pauli Murray's memory. So there you go. All right, now is the time for the big interview, and I cannot tell you, incredibly thrilled to have our guest today. His name is Art Cullen, and Art Cullen is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and the author of a book, Storm Lake, A Chronicle of Change, Resilience, and Hope from a Heartland Newspaper. Art's also the editor of the Storm Lake Times in Iowa. That is a family-run weekly newspaper in Storm Lake. Population 10,134. I would note that that's about 1,000 people less than last year. He's also heavily featured in the documentary Storm Lake, which will be part of the Twin Cities Film Festival later this month. Art Cullen, welcome to Ellie 2.0 Radio. How are you?
Thanks. I'm fine. We're changing to fall here.
Well, you are. And Art, some of my longtime listeners will remember that you were on the show about 3 years ago. We talked to you, and so much has happened since then. I wanted to have you come back. And Art, we should also make sure the listeners know that earlier this year, you actually published an opinion piece that I wrote about my inability to return to Iowa to live, to close out my life because of the way the political situation is in Iowa against LGBTQ people. So we should make sure everyone knows that. Art, there's so much I want to talk to you about, but let's begin with you giving me sort of the pulse of what's going on in Storm Lake in central Iowa right now.
Okay, well, we're in northwest Iowa, very rural, conservative part of the state, definitely Farm Bureau country. Our congressman for 20 years was Steve King, who was real tight with Michelle Bachmann. And now it's another guy who has a better suit of clothes, but the same essential views, and that's Randy Feenstra. And another Republican, very, very conservative, anti-immigrant. And so the situation here remains tense. There's a lot of immigrants here who are waiting for a resolution to get them out of their limbo of being undocumented. There's a lot of anxiety over COVID, but Iowa is sort of a wild west when it comes to COVID. There's very little in terms of testing or regulation. So there's a lot of things up in the air right now, and the politics of the state are veering toward the right at a fairly solid clip.
Veering, I think, we need to put that in quotation marks, because my view is that the state has gone so far right. It's hard to even see how it resembles the Iowa that I grew up in back in the 70s and the 80s.
Right.
You know, the days of Robert Ray, who said that he would take in all of the, as many Vietnamese and Laotian immigrants as the state could handle, and was welcoming. But Art, okay, thanks for that read. You and your newspaper represent this independent journalism of small town, small city America that is so critically important. And the documentary Storm Lake is in part about you trying to keep the paper going, trying to deal with COVID, where you lost a lot of advertisers, and trying to keep the paper going in the face of what you just talked about, this onslaught of conservative movement going on in Iowa. Can you talk about all of that, please? And a big, long question, I know, Art.
Well, yeah. During the pandemic, I was sitting here in my home on Irving Street, 200 yards north of this beautiful lake, and thinking that, the world was imploding in April of 2020. And the newspaper was going broke fast. There was, rioting in the streets later in Minneapolis. It was just a horrible time, 2020. And we lost a ton of money and lost another half ton of money in the first half of this year. And we weren't sure what was going to happen. And but we organized something called the Western Iowa Journalism Foundation to support independent, family-owned newspapers in Western Iowa, us and the Carroll Times Herald, and La Prensa, which is a Latino publication in Western Iowa, the Coon Rapids newspaper. These are towns from 900 people to 10 to 15,000 people, all of where their newspapers are struggling. And since then, we've raised about $150,000. We got for the foundation, which allowed us to get a grant of about $15,000, combined with the PPP loan, kept us from closing. If it weren't for Nancy Pelosi and the payroll protection program, the Storm Lake Times would not exist today.
Oh, wow. Okay. Art, before you go any further, tell us the name of that foundation again. And is that foundation open where people can send money if they want to?
Yes, it's the Western Iowa Journalism Foundation.com. That's a very long title, Western Iowa Journalism Foundation.com. Okay. And it was approved in January by the IRS as a 501c3 nonprofit. So you can donate tax deductible to this foundation. But the newspapers are for profit.
Right.
And so it's kind of a new model, and it's modeled after what the Seattle Times did. They started their own foundation. This is the only foundation we're aware of that's supporting multiple newspapers. Okay.
Okay, well, that's great, and that's a great concept and a great idea. Tell us, Art, you really laser focused on what was happening with COVID in Storm Lake, in part because you have a lot of people there who were born outside the United States that are working in the food processing industry. And Art, you know what? We're going to have to take a break. But when we come back, I just realized when we come back, I'd like you to talk about that because Art, that was incredibly important journalism that you did. All right?
Great.
Okay. All right, listeners, we're going to take a break. You're listening to me, Ellie Krug, on Ellie 2.0 Radio. I've been speaking with Art Cullen, who is the editor of the Storm Lake Times in Storm Lake, Iowa. When we come back, we'll hear more from Art. Thanks.
How long till my soul gets it right? Can any human being ever reach that kind of light? I call on the resting soul of Galileo, king of night vision.
And we're back. Ellie 2.0 Radio, Ellie Krug here. All right, before we took our break, we had started the big interview with Art Cullen, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist from Storm Lake, Iowa. His newspaper, the Storm Lake Times, is chronicled in a movie, Storm Lake, which we'll get to in a second. Art, before we took the break, I brought up how your paper laser focused on what was happening in Storm Lake with people who are not born in the United States, who are working in the food processing plants, how COVID was decimating those folks. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how your piece rustled up a lot of feathers?
Well, yeah. Early on in the pandemic, it only made sense that you'd have a lot of COVID cases in meatpacking plants where people are working shoulder to shoulder without any personal protective equipment like face masks. And it's a very humid environment in a packing plant, and so it's just a breeding ground for respiratory illness of any sort. And then President Trump, in conspiracy with the governors of Iowa, Nebraska, and South Dakota, ordered these people back into work, come hell or high water, with no testing, no therapies available at the time, no vaccines, and because the big meat supply chain was so brittle from concentration over the last 50 years that they couldn't keep up with production, and meat prices shot up 50%. So they just marched these people into these packing houses, and there was like 1,000 cases of COVID in a pork facility here in Storm Lake, a Tyson pork facility, and so we were calling for the state to get in and start testing, and we finally got them to come in and start testing at these plants and start reporting the data on a daily basis, and then we worked with ProPublica to obtain emails from state and local health authorities combined with meatpacking officials and federal officials that showed them trying to develop strategies that would allow them to get people back into work faster without going through full quarantines and the like. And, it was one of the most cynical displays I've seen in my 40 years of journalism. And meatpacking is a tough business, and they're tough operators. But I didn't realize how craven they actually were. And especially when you put them in with Trump and the trio of governors, the three amigos of Kim Reynolds, Pete Ricketts, and Kristi Noem. It's a frightful combination.
Well, it is, and I mean, but 1,000 COVID cases in a city of Storm Lake, which is population at this point barely 10,000 people. I mean, it's amazing. It's just appalling, and of course, you had a number of deaths as a result of that.
Well, yeah, we've had at least 6 deaths, but we're really not sure how many people died from COVID or were hospitalized because the state's record keeping is so poor and its reporting is non-existent.
Right. Okay. Now, let's move on. I want to talk about this documentary, Storm Lake, and tell us a little bit about what it's about? How did it get started? I mean, how did the documentary come about, and what does it represent? I mean, what did you try and hope that the documentary would accomplish?
Well, yeah, it's a beautiful film by my objective point of view. And it all started in 2017 when we won this Pulitzer Prize for editorial writing about surface water pollution, agricultural surface water pollution in Iowa that was infecting the drinking water supply in Des Moines, the state capital. And this guy who is a cinematographer out in New York, he grew up on an Iowa hog farm in northern Iowa called Buffalo Center, just south of the Minnesota border. And he saw in the New York Times one morning, he'd been shooting for Anthony Bourdain for 15 years. He was the director of photography for the real popular CNN show that Anthony Bourdain hosted about food. And Anthony Bourdain, of course, ended his life. And so Jerry was looking for something. Jerry Rishis is his name. And he saw this story in the New York Times about a little paper in Northwest Iowa that won a Pulitzer. And so he just called me up and said, "Hey, I'm coming home to visit my parents on the farm. Would you mind if I just stopped by for an afternoon in Storm Lake and shot a teaser reel?" And I said, "That's fine. If we're what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If we're going to nose into people's business, you can nose into our business." And so he came and shot this teaser reel and attracted one of the top independent documentary producers in the business. Her name's Beth Levison. After she read a piece I read that I wrote for the New York Times about how our small town needs immigrants. And she was moved by it. And so they decided to do this movie. And so we started in 2018 filming, and they came in for 70 days and shot about 300 hours of video and edited it down to 85 minutes. And it'll air on PBS Independence Lens program on November 15th. And what I had hoped was that it would be a piece of journalism about journalism, and that's exactly what it is. They took a very journalistic approach, verite style of photography, where the subjects do all the speaking. There's no narrator, no writing. It's all the pictures and the people telling their own stories. And what came out of it really was a distillation into a treatise on civic engagement and how important it is to get involved in the Iowa caucuses for Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or Andrew Yang, and how important it is that little towns have city council members. And so the movie shows us covering a guy planting yard signs in this little community called Alta and delivering heads of organic cabbage that he'd grown to poor people living in trailer homes. And it's about how the newspaper, how local news really is the glue that holds the foundation of democracy together. You can't have democracy without an informed electorate. And we're fighting a great tide of disinformation.
We are.
These days. And that's what this movie is about. It's about how facts can prevail.
Well, the civic engagement thing about how an independent press can show up and write the truth, right? And people can read it. That's one thing. The problem, of course, in a country right now is we have people who do not want to read the truth. And that's, to me, it's unfathomable, but I mean, that's just where we are. And we don't have time to go down that rabbit hole. I'm sorry I brought it up.
Yeah.
Well,
you know what?
Yeah.
Marvin Gaye recorded the album "What's Going On" 50 years ago.
Yep.
And it's taken that long for us to begin contemplating what the real question is, and we are now in Detroit and Minneapolis, attempting to answer that question. But
Art,
I think there is a dialogue going on it's just a minority of people are unplugging from reality.
Okay, but hold on. Yeah, hold on, Art. One thing I want you to, if you can give us 30 seconds to tell us the success story of Storm Lake about welcoming and incorporating people who are not born in the U.S., because it is a tremendous story. Just give us something about that.
Yeah, well, earlier you referred to Governor Bob Ray and how he invited the Thai Dam people to bring their entire culture to Iowa from Thailand refugee camps. And one of the first beachheads was in Storm Lake, where we now have this beautiful gold-plated Buddhist temple. And then waves of Latinos came in, and when there weren't enough Asians to work in the meatpacking plants. And so now we have about 30 languages spoken in Storm Lake, or dialects. And Buena Vista University, a local private college, is offering full ride tuition, full rides to first generation college students. The University of Iowa set up a special Storm Lake Scholars Program for those similarly for first generation college students. So we think by embracing immigration as vitality, and we're educating our own to be the leaders of Storm Lake tomorrow and to engage and to take their stake in the community, which they are now. It's taken us 30 years, but we have Latino school board and city council members, homegrown Latino cops and teachers, and we can start fresh here. Just by sheer scale, it's a lot easier to manage than it is in Minneapolis, for example.
Right.
We're making progress.
Well, I know, but much of America doesn't have any idea about the story about Storm Lake and the success there, or in other towns. I mean, you're not alone in the country where people have come from other countries, set down roots, and the community has embraced them and said, "You're welcome. We want you here." And Art, I would love to talk further about this, but I'm watching our time. And so here's the last question. Art, what made you so idealistic? How did that happen?
Well, my parents were Irish Catholic FDR Democrats, and I can't help it. I was born that way. My dad ran for state legislature on the Kennedy ticket, the JFK ticket, and had a cross burned in his honor in Buena Vista County. So that makes me idealistic.
Well, those are pretty good chops to have, if you ask me. So last thoughts. Tell me what else you would have liked me to have asked you in this interview that I haven't done.
How you can subscribe to the Storm Lake Times.
Do it.
Yes, www.stormlake.com. And let me put in one more plug, Western Iowa Journalism Foundation.com. Thank you.
Art, thank you so very much for being on Ellie 2.0 Radio. Someday I'll have you back again because I just can't get enough of you, okay? Thanks for being on the show. All right, okay.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. All right, listeners, that was Art Cullen of the Storm Lake Times, and somebody I greatly admire, as you can pick up from what I've been saying. All right, when we come back, we'll do the C block where I'm going to talk about my work as an idealist. We'll be back in a second. Thanks. And we're back. Ellie 2.0 Radio. Listen, I could, and I'm not exaggerating, I could spend 2 hours interviewing Art Cullen. He is, first of all, he's a bit of a character, which, in a good sense. But secondly, he knows so much. He's so passionate. He's got this insight. I mean, incredible. And he's fighting to save a newspaper. which is so incredibly important, and other newspapers as well. So check out the documentary, Storm Lake. Go to the Twin Cities Film Festival in Minneapolis. I believe it begins on the 21st of October and runs till the end of the month. Might be off a little bit on the start date, but nonetheless, check it out. Go see the documentary. Okay? Thanks. All right. C Block, my work. So this week, I had the pleasure, and I think that's the right word, for sure, extreme pleasure might be the right word, right phrase, of presenting Gray Area Thinking at the Wayzata Community Church. It was Monday night. Oh, and I don't know if, for those of you in Minnesota, you may remember this, others you don't know this, but it was a gorgeous, gorgeous night. But people decided that they would go to a church and sit inside for close to 2 hours to listen to me, to get a training about how to be more inclusive to other humans. We had almost 50 people. And it went well. I mean, we had people very moved at times because the training can be challenging but emotional and it involves vulnerability and things like that. You've heard me talk about Gray Area Thinking a number of times. And it was well received by a lot of people. And it warmed my heart as well. It really did. But I got to that church because of a 75-year-old woman named Nan Peterson. Now, I've got to tell you, Nan Peterson, I don't even know if she stands 5'5". She is very distinguished looking. She's got a shock of just white hair, but we're very, very, very distinctive, as I said, and very, she is the kind of person that when you meet her, you don't forget her. And for some reason, Nan Peterson has decided that she believes in Ellie Krug and my work. And so earlier this year, she had arranged for me to speak to do an online event for one of their social engagement groups. And I had about 25 or 30 people online. We did part of Gray Area Thinking. We didn't do the whole training. And then she said, Ellie, we want to bring you back. We want to bring you back to the church. We want you to come live. We want you to give us the whole Gray Area Thinking thing. And on Monday night, she introduced me, and we did the training. Now, I bring Nan Peterson up, and by the way, I have her permission to use her name. I bring her up because she is first an ally to me and my work. And allies are so incredibly important because without allies, I literally could not do my work. I cannot just simply put a sign outside somewhere and say, hey, it's Ellie Krug, come to one of my talks where I'm trying to change the world by getting people to get along with each other better. It's not the way it works. And so people have to believe in me, believe in my work, and then they have to use some political capital to get me in the door of an organization. They have to say, hey, well, hold on, we need to have Ellie come and talk to us. And not always is that easy for allies to do that. Sometimes they're like, well, we don't have the time, or we don't have the budget, although I try not to make money like the pivotal thing. Or they say, well, you know what? I don't know if we want a transgender person here. It might make people uncomfortable. All of those kinds of barriers that I encounter in trying to get my work done. Nan Peterson, she doesn't care about any of that. She just, I want Ellie Krug to come to our church. I'm going to arrange for that. She has a committee that she works with, and thankfully the committee also, I think they take a lot of cues from Nan Peterson, but the committee also, wanted me to come as well. So that's, of course, very helpful. So I tell you about Nan Peterson because she is an incredible ally. But I also tell you about Nan Peterson because she is a role model. She's 75, as I said. So she's about 10 years older than me. She's teaching me. Every time I see her, she's teaching me about class, like in a classy way to do things. She's teaching me about persistence, resiliency, grit, and that age doesn't matter. So I'm learning from this woman as she is learning from me, but I am learning so many things from her as well. And so were the people in the room when we did the training on Monday night. It was very clear that they hold Nan dear. And it was very clear that she was esteemed in their eyes for who she was. Now, we all need role models. We do. Some would tell you that I'm a role model for other people. That is such an honor whenever I hear that. But we all need role models. And sometimes we need to be role models, as I said. Who are your role models? You know, and have you thanked them? Have you told them how much you admire them? I have tried to do that with Nan. And hopefully if she listens to this show ever, she will know that I admire her with the greatest amount of respect and sense of awe. There's that word again. Because nothing's holding her down. She's had some health issues, but she's like, bouncing back from that and just going forward. And so find those in your life that you want to help give you a sense of practice. Okay? By that I mean, this is how I can do it when I am that age. That kind of practice. That's what role model is. You're getting a sense of practice. You're seeing how it would work so that someday you can do it yourself. So, Nan Peterson, thank you for believing in me and my work. And thank you for having been so incredibly kind to me, as well as to all the other folks that were at the Wazeda Community Church. Okay, everyone, that's another show down. I hope that you've enjoyed it. Big thanks to my producer, Brett Johnson. Brett had to go through a couple of calisthenics this morning to get this thing going, and he did great. To you listeners, please tell others about my show. I love having people listen to the show. Last week I talked about Fear in the C Block. I had a number of people reach out to me after that and tell me how they appreciated that I talked about fear. So there you go. Okay, go and have a good week. I'll be back next week. And in the meantime, go and try and do something to make the world a better place. Thanks so very much. Take care. Bye-bye.